Okay, so good morning, everyone. I'm going to be talking about trauma. And trauma comes in many different forms. And a psychological trauma is a response to an event that a person finds highly stressful. And it doesn't have to be anything great big for a person to have experienced trauma. It depends on the person, it depends on the event, it depends on their history. But this is, some examples, and I'll give more later, but these are some examples of trauma, and that is being in a war zone. I watch the news on TV about Ukraine, and I can't imagine living in a war zone. It's just beyond my comprehension. And I get stressful just watching it on TV. Can you imagine living there? Some of them are living in basements, some of them are living, all together. So anyway, a war zone, of course, would produce trauma. Or any natural disaster, and we see them all the time, flooding, hurricanes, fires. Another thing is an accident. I don't know why we've been having so many train collisions. I've noticed every few days on the news. I mean, I don't just sit and watch the news all the time, but I do watch the evening news most days. And there's been a lot of train accidents, but if you've been in a car wreck, even, that's traumatizing. And it doesn't have to be a really bad car wreck. It is, if you've ever been in a car wreck, it's just very jarring to your body and into your senses. And if you've been in a really bad accident, that can really produce trauma. And or any form of an accident. And of course, rape, childhood abuse, and there's 5 forms of childhood abuse that we talk about. And that's the sexual, that's physical, that's mental and emotional. And that mental and emotional includes abandonment, a lot of and neglect. A lot of people will come to us and deny that they have any trauma. And once we get into their childhood, maybe they have grown up in a very affluent family. The parents, were doing, their thing, making a living. And what we find a lot of times is those parents are very focused on the outside, not so much on the inside with the children. And it can produce neglect, that emotional neglect, and no one would ever think that. Ministers' children, doctors' children, anywhere where there is a work ethic in the family, where their focus is outside of the family, a lot of times that will produce a form of trauma, that neglect and feelings of abandonment. Divorce will do that. Divorce can be traumatizing for a child. And intellectual abuse, telling a child that, calling them names, they're stupid, or you don't know that, or you're too young to learn that, or that intellectual abuse. And then spiritual abuse. Spiritual abuse is where, for one thing, when parents try to cram religion down a child's throat, particularly a teenager, that can be a form of spiritual abuse. It can turn a child off of ever wanting to go to church. But another form of spiritual abuse that can create trauma for a child is where a child is made to be more than they are. Some parents will put children on a pedestal. Maybe they have several children, but that there's be one, that golden boy or that golden girl, that is so beautiful. They'll put them up on a pedestal, and they make them almost like a god or a goddess, and that can be spiritual abuse. So The response is to any kind of trauma is freeze. We either freeze up or we flight, we run away, or we try to fight our way through it, or we fawn. Now, fawn, F-A-W-N, I'm just learning this. I was on, and I'll tell you more about it after a while, but I was on a video, a broadcast the other day on trauma on Facebook. And I had kind of heard of fawning, but I really understood the definition of fawning. So it's freeze, flight, fight, or fawn. Fawn is where you take care of other people. It's codependency at the max. It's where that's how you focus on other people instead of on your own insides. It's that caretaking. It is codependency 101 is when you fawn over another person, that gets you out of your own trauma. You don't have to look at your own pain, your own issues when you're focused outward. And so there's a person who has been traumatized in any form, and keep in mind, I'm looking here at Jeff Ramsey's cute little puppy dog. That's all I can look at is that cute little puppy dog.
There's a squirrel.
And it doesn't look like Jeff, but anyway, I'm going to get back to myself here. The people that have been traumatized actually go through the grief process. The grief process is, we've talked about a lot, is, the grief process, the first thing is denial. People that have been traumatized, and keep in mind, a day in the life of a child is much different than a day in the life of an adult. What is said or done to a child, particularly if they're little sensitive children, and not everyone will be traumatized by the same thing. Some people, something can happen and they won't internalize it, but then some do. And so the first thing is about denial. Deny that the abuse happened, deny that it bothered you. Well, it wasn't that big, it didn't bother me. Denial is don't even know I'm lying, is what denial is. And then, if you finally get past the denial, I know in my own personal life, it took me a long time to own my own childhood sexual abuse, because I had made up in my mind, and it's actually the next stage, I had made up in my mind, and in a child's mind, I guess this is what I did in order to be able to endure the sexual abuse. But I made up in my mind that my father mistaken me for my mother, and that's how I could cope with it. And I worked with a therapist that I thought she was going to beat up on me until I could finally get past that denial stage and get past the bargaining, because the bargaining is, well, I think he thought it was my mother, bargaining, and bargaining that it's that bad. Well, it was just one time, or what, So, and then, once we get past the denial and the bargaining, we get into the anger. And a lot of people that have been traumatized will stay in that anger. I know I did, until I could get some really, really good help. And it took a lot of help for me, and it took a long time for me. So, don't get discouraged if you have had some trauma in your childhood and that you have to keep working on it. To not keep working on it is a disservice to yourself. When you think, well, I've been in therapy so-and-so, it took me about 12 years to work completely through my childhood abuse. Now, I didn't sit in a therapist's office all the time. I went to a 30-day trauma program down in Florida. I would do, an 8-day retreat, or I'd do a 6-day, or I'd do a weekend, and what I was told and what we tell clients is you go do a piece of work, you go do your work. Like that's why we have the 4-day intensive, so people can come in on a short term and do a piece of work, some deep work, and pull off a layer, and then go out and celebrate that. How you celebrate it as you live your life, and feel that freedom. And then if that pain comes back or other layers of pain, come back and do another intensive. We've had people that come 2 or 3 times a year or twice a year, maybe came to inpatient, and then they would come back, a couple of times a year. Because if you have had any form of abuse, childhood abuse, you're not going to get over it in one 4-day or a few sessions with a therapist. If you've had a lifetime or in your childhood of different forms of abuse, it's going to take a while and get with a good therapist. A good therapist is someone that has been trained in trauma. Now, there's good therapists out there that haven't been trained in trauma. So make sure whoever you're going to has been trained in trauma. Now, talk therapy can be good to an extent. What talk therapy will do is to help you get your story straight. But after a while, you can talk it to death. You can talk it and talk it and talk it and wear it completely out. And trauma stays in the very cells of our bodies. Now, and how it gets there is through the brain. Trauma doesn't just go to the muscles and the bones and our body, but it comes through the brain and it settles in our body, and it comes out with stress-related illnesses. Arthritis is a really good illustration. And I've got a list of things that I'll go over with you here in a minute. But the body accommodates the mind. And so in looking for a good therapist, make sure, what I always tell people is go interview a therapist. Go interview them. It's worth it paying, for an hour, and you really get 50 minutes, but anyway, it's worth paying that to go interview a therapist and see what kind of training they have had in trauma. And like I said, talk therapy will help you to get your story straight, but after a while, you need to move more than that, beyond that. And speaking of movement, some kind of movement therapy. Somatic breath work is wonderful. The shame and anger reduction work that we do here through that we do in the 4-day and we do in the inpatient, to find some freedom, to release, some release work, to get those feelings out of the body and out. We do a lot of empty chair work where you literally can visualize your abuser and give back the shame and anger. And so that kind of experiential work works much better with trauma than talk therapy. Now, I'm not discounting all talk therapy, but get your story straight, and if that particular therapist can't take you farther than that, find some more help. And then like we have therapists send clients here and they will tell us this is what they need to work on. There'll be something specific that the therapist will want them to work on. So they'll come in and do a 4-day, and really the type of work we do here, you can't do in a 1 hour or 2 hour session in a therapist's office. So therapists will send their clients here, we'll do a large piece of work with them and send them back to their therapist. And then they may send them back 6 months later or a year later, but just be willing to keep working on the trauma until it is no longer running your life. And another thing about therapy that I really like this process is, and this is just me, and every therapist or counselor works different, but I like for people to do their shame and anger reduction work, do that anger work, the shame work, to get rid, of some of the shame, or to even recognize the shame that you're carrying from the perpetrator, whoever the perpetrator is. But then to follow that up with EMDR. EMDR is one of the best therapeutic interventions that we have around today, particularly for any form of trauma. But that, and I guess it's because of my own experience. I did a lot of different types of therapy while I was working on the trauma. And then EMDR had just come out. And I went to a workshop in Dallas, and a professional workshop, to find out what it was, and I thought, I need to do that. And there was a woman there from Austin, and she was going to incorporate that in her practice, and she did the training, notified me. I went to Austin, and I think I did 8 sessions. I would go down and spend 2-3 days and do a couple of sessions, then go back and do. Anyway, that is the end of my of working on the trauma. And I had a lot of childhood trauma, but that was like it closed it up. It got the brain back on track. It cleared those nerve waves. So anyway, I'm a big believer in EMDR. And one of the things, we have never offered it at Shades, and one of our therapists has gone and done the training, and so we're incorporating that into and Jeff is applauding. I think he has maybe had some sessions. But what it does, it's not as invasive as some of the treatment that we do, the therapy that we do. But I like for a client to follow up with the EMDR, because it clears the track of and like I said, my oldest daughter, Karen, is a master's LCP therapist, and she went and did the EMDR therapy and is working with all the clients in inpatient. And so we're seeing some very, very good results, because our job here is what we want people to do, is be able to live their life on a daily basis without having to carry around that, the abuse from the past. So these are some things that emotionally that happens, is the denial, the bargaining, the anger comes up, and sometimes that anger turns to rage. That's where I stopped, because I was a rager, and it can turn to rage. That if you're a rager, that is a really good indicator that you have some unresolved childhood work to do. There's something underlining that if your anger is bigger than what it really needs to be, there must be something underneath there. Fear, if you've got overdeveloped fear, you can pretty much count on that there is some form of trauma that has not been addressed. If it's, fear is God gave it to us for protection. But if you've got that exaggerated fear, there might be something in your past, like I said, some form of trauma that has not been dealt with. And then sadness, if you're just overloaded with sadness, or if you do feel that shame, if you're ashamed of your body, if you have, shame in who you are, your very being. Shame is a real indicator of childhood or any form of trauma that you've experienced. If you've been a driver in a car accident, a lot of times the driver will carry lots and lots of shame of that, or any thing that has happened that you feel guilty over. In fact, guilt is down farther. It can produce the shame. And shame is like carrying around, wearing a black cloak around you every day. And then it produces anxiety and depression. Or the other thing, numbness. People will just feel numb. They'll have no feeling. We get a lot of therapists that will send people to us that has reported their history of trauma, and they can talk about it pretty much like news, weather, and sports, but haven't done any work around it, and so they're just numb, and they'll send them to us to help jar that memory, and that is a defense mechanism, is to use just to numb out. And then the guilt, a lot of abuse survivors, people who suffer from trauma, carry the guilt of the trauma as if they caused it, and so guilt is a big one. And then that feeling of hopelessness is like, I don't care what I do, I can't get any better. And then irritability, where, you have one nerve left and everyone's getting on it. When you've got that going, you can pretty much count that there is something going on that you haven't addressed. Unless there's something in your present life that is causing your irritability, you need to look at that and see, because it can be chronic irritability, where everybody just gets on that one last nerve of yours. And then I can't read my own writing down here, but so I really can't read my own writing. There's one left, but I can't read it, so I don't guess we need to talk about that one. So I want to give you the physical response. The body accommodates the mind, and that's why, we have to incorporate the mind and body. We don't have a split. It's not like the mind's over here and the body's over here. We've got to incorporate both of them. Mister, will you hand me my pen down there? Thank you. So the physical responses are headaches. And headaches are, chronic headaches is a real good sign of having some unresolved trauma. Headaches, because you're carrying it right in here. And digestive system. If you're having a lot of stomach problems, you can almost count there is something unresolved, because like I said, the body accommodates the mind. Fatigue, if you are tired a lot, it takes a lot of energy to drag around unresolved conflict, unresolved trauma. It takes a lot, it wears you out, takes all of your energy away. And then you might have a racing heart. If you have that, if you get into the memory of the abuse, particularly if it includes any kind of physical or sexual abuse, or being chased, or being kidnapped, or all of that can create a racing heart. And it doesn't have to be that dramatic. It can be when you have that memory or you have the racing heart, you might think you're having a heart attack. If you keep having it, well, of course, you check with your doctor. But if it's not heart problems, and I believe it I think the body will begin to break down. Trauma can cause a lot of things, but the racing heart is like being chased by something. Your trauma is chasing you. If you have excessive sweating, palms of your hands sweating, it's a good sign. I've got hiccups right now. Another thing is if you're just always feeling jumpy, just, if someone walks up behind you, you squeal, you get scared. I have had that a lot in my life. It's better. People knew, we teach people how to treat us, and eventually I taught people, do not scare me, do not come up behind me and touch me, because when you've had any form of childhood sexual or physical abuse, the body remembers, and so when you're touched, it just can recreate that in a second, and you may not remember it in your brain in that second, but the body will remember. Okay, so issues such, again, is depression, anxiety, and also substance abuse. Now, if we have the brain chemistry of an addict, trauma can create and get us to seek something to ease that pain. It's painful to carry around unresolved trauma. And so, if you've got the brain of an addict, when we seek out something to eat or drink to ease the pain of living, what pops out is an addict. And so you have to look at the physical response is substance abuse disorder and eating disorders. And remember, the brain and the body remembers. And it's not, disconnected. It's connected together. Okay, research has shown here in the United States, 60 to 75% of Americans have experienced some form of trauma event. And that trauma as a child can be bullying. I'll tell you, can I share about Evan? My friend, Misty, she's like my adopted granddaughter. Her son, Evan, it's 13, he just turned 13. He had some bullying at school, and what made it even worse was the kids he ran around with that he had grown up with. They'd gone to school since they were 4 years old, and this is what kids do. They will pick out one person and they'll all kind of bully that person. I don't know if it's some kind of a game. I don't know if they're just trying, just being adolescents. But he was the target for a lot of bullying back in the fall, to the point that he didn't want to go to school, to the point that he wanted to change schools. And his mother is, she is a lot of power in a small package. She stood up to the son and would not move him to another school. And she thought about it because it was killing him, and he would cry and cry and cry. But as a family, they worked through it. They went to school. They talked to the school counselor. And of course, the son didn't want her to go to the school counselor. Well, then they'll know. Anyway, finally, what happened to break that cycle, one of his best friends was the one that was bullying him the most. He got him down in the bathroom. Evan got him down in the bathroom one day and beat him up. And that was the end of the bullying. And, her son is not one to beat anyone up, but he had taken it as long as he could. So anyway, if your kid comes home and talks about bullying, check into it, because it can be horrendous for kids. Harassment in the workplace by superiors. And that can be sexual harassment, that can be mental and emotional harassment. physical harassment, uh, any form of sexual abuse, sexual assault, traffic accidents, life-threatening illnesses. All of these things produce trauma. Uh, sudden a sudden loss of a loved one. My husband, we knew he was dying. I mean, and he laid in our home in a hospital bed for 2 weeks. And we did start the grieving process, but you can't really grieve anything till you have the loss. And so, but I know that my grieving process was, I went through the whole grief process, but there wasn't any shock in it. There wasn't a shock there because I knew he was dying, and he was so sick. It was almost his last day. It was almost a relief for him to go on for him, because the pain, he would not have wanted to live like that, and he was in a coma and all that. But when someone suddenly loses a loved one, that can be very traumatic, and that can cause trauma that needs to be addressed. Being attacked, being kidnapped, acts of terrorism, 9/11. I mean, we all went through that. If you're old enough, it's, that affected everyone. So, when you live in trauma, it can be very isolating. And if you have I use that different, you can have one act of trauma. That's an isolated event, one act. That can affect particularly a child. I don't care what it is, that can can affect a child or an adult. But now if you have ongoing trauma and you're traumatized over and over and over and over, it must be addressed, and it will take longer than if you have only had one episode of trauma. Like if you had been sexually abused one time by the neighbor down the street, there's no discounting that. It is trauma. And it's not easy to work through, but it is different than chronic trauma, to where it has gone on for year after year after year. So, there is a difference there. All right, so what is the solution? The solution is seek professional help. Seek help. If you don't, you're going to stay in it, and it will get worse. You will begin to traumatize yourself by your own trauma. And what that means is you'll begin to, like I said, use a substance, or you'll begin to hide out in your house. You'll begin to sleep all the time. And so the first thing, the stages of recovery, is stabilization and safety. If you're not living in a safe home, get somewhere where you're safe. A lot of times children live in homes, and I'll tell you, I'm not proud of this, but there's times that I created a home that wasn't real stable. My husband, and I didn't do it by myself, my husband and I, he was a practicing alcoholic. I was practicing compulsive overeating. I was a rager. I'd be a perfect mother, Miss Molly homemaker one day, and 2 days later I would be a screaming, raging idiot to the kids. That is abuse. That is abuse. And so the first thing that you have to do is some stabilization. Get stabilized in your trauma and find some safety. And I'll tell you, it made a difference in my children, and my adult children will talk about how they can remember the changes in me, and as I changed, the changes in the house, in the home. And so, I'll spend the rest of my life making amends to my children, and the way I make amends to my children or to anyone, I don't rage anymore. And God removed that from my brain, thank you, God. All right, and then the second one is mourning. You must mourn the trauma, and this is where, and you must remember the trauma. A lot of people want to make it not. They'll trivialize it. Oh, it's not that bad. It's not as bad as some people's. Well, it was just this. It was just a divorce. It was this abandonment, emotional abandonment, and neglect are two of the highest forms of childhood abuse. When a child is neglected emotionally, like if having a work addict father or a work addict mother where they're out of the home, that's neglect. A young child doesn't know if the parent is out working, making a living, or if all that child is experiencing is that neglect, from that emotional neglect. So more than that, remember the loss, remember the trauma, but we don't want to stay in it and go through those stages of grief. Allow yourself to go through it. Go through it with a therapist. The anger, the bargaining, the denial, the bargaining, the anger, the depression, that pain will hit. Allow yourself to feel the pain of it. Why wouldn't you feel the pain of it? And then, the surrender of, I can't do this, God, help me. And then the acceptance, when you get to that acceptance level, you're accepting that you have been traumatized. You didn't ask for it, it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility to get help for it and move through it. And don't think it's going to be one and done, it may be ongoing. And don't discount the therapy that you get if the trauma, the memory comes back. It's not that you've had poor therapy, it means you haven't had enough. Keep doing it, keep peeling off those layers. And then the third thing is integration, to integrate we call it the inner child. Integrate, see that the person inside that was traumatized, and begin to have that integration and begin to love that part of yourself and to accept that part of yourself. You are not flawed. If you've been traumatized, if you've been sexually abused, you are not broken, you are not flawed. You've really, people that have been traumatized, and I'm going to give you a name of a book in a minute, but people that have been traumatized that have worked through it are some of the strongest people in the world. We're not weak people. We are strong. If you've been traumatized, look at the oyster. We were talking about this the other day. How they produce these beautiful pearls, and it's by a grain of sand, and they get that irritation, and that irritation grows and grows, that little grain of sand, until it grows into a beautiful pearl. Now that's what recovery will look like from trauma, is that trauma grates on us like that grain of sand grates on an oyster. It grates on us and grates on us and can paralyze us with trauma. But recovery is where we reconnect, have that reconnection with that part of ourself that was traumatized. And then do the release work, like what we do here. Every one of you have been through, well, most of you have been through shades, and it's that release work, giving it back where it came from. And don't forget, you don't have to give it back to living parents. It is like using empty chair work. It is the different types of therapeutic modality to give that shame and anger back where it came from. So, and then I want to mention one more time of what to do about trauma. Get help. EMDR works, movement therapy works, body works, get good massages. Now, roughing will help if you've had a lot of trauma, a lot of sexual abuse, and you're holding that in your body. Rolfing will help, but make sure you go to someone. Rolfing is a form of massage, but make sure you go to someone that will help you with your pain level, because Rolfing can be very painful, so, but good body work, good massage work. And if you can go to someone that understands trauma, ask them when you call to make an appointment for therapy, ask them if they understand trauma, because they can help you have a release in your body, because we keep it in the very cells of our bodies a lot of times. So I want to talk to you, and I'm going to open it up for questions. Last Tuesday, there was a book that came out, and I got to watch, and I want to talk about her in a minute, but I got to watch this, what was it?
It was like a podcast,
It was
live podcast.
It was a live
Facebook.
podcast on Facebook, an hour long, and this woman was introducing her new book, and it was called Unbroken, and she has spent 9 years researching trauma, and she started with her own trauma process. And I love what she said. When we've been traumatized, we feel broken, and a lot of times we're kind of encouraged to stay broken, but we're not broken. I mean, trauma will make you stronger. If it doesn't kill you, it'll make you stronger. It really will. So this book, Unbroken, I would really encourage you to read that. It's all about trauma. Like I said, she has done research, and there'll be some of her own personal trauma story in there, but it's Unbroken by Mike, M.C. McDonald. She's a PhD, M.C. McDonald, Unbroken. She was on a podcast with, one of my new best friends, Annie Lamont. I don't know, do any of y'all know Amy Lamont? Have any of you read her book? Shake your head if you have. I can't believe that y'all don't know about Annie Lamont. Annie Lamont has been writing books for years and years. I've read every one of them. She's in recovery, and she talks about it. I'm not breaking her anonymity. She has many years, over 25 years of recovery from alcoholism, and she can write a book without ever mentioning her membership to any 12-step program. She's also recovered from an eating disorder, but she writes about mercy and grace. I mean, she does the most uplifting writing of any author that I've ever seen. But she also is so humorous. You'll be crying one minute and laughing the next. So this is what I'm reading. I don't know if it's one of her newest. She's writing a new one right now, but it's called Hallelujah Anyway. She finds the good in everything. But anyway, I got to meet her on the cruise. And Annie she lives in San Francisco, and although y'all have not heard of her, she's very famous. She's been on the bestseller list in New York, bestseller list for years and years. She keeps a book on there, for years and years and years. I would encourage you. Her books are small. Her books are easy to read. Her books are uplifting. And I sound like I'm her agent. But anyway, Annie has agreed to come on our Tennie Talks one Wednesday. She's out of town. She travels a lot, and she teaches writing and all. So anyway, we were texting yesterday, and she's agreed to come on on Tennie Talks. So I hope that I will encourage y'all to check out some of her books before she comes on. It will mean a lot to you, and then in hearing her, because she is I could just sit and listen to her all day. She's had, like some of us, she's had some trauma, a lot of trauma in her life, but she has walked through it. She's just amazing. She's amazing. And I tease her about, and I'm going to buy her a t-shirt that says, I love Jesus, but I cuss a little. She loves Jesus, but she does cuss a little bit. There's a t-shirt that says that. I love Jesus, but I cuss a little. I would get Annie a t-shirt. So anyway, I would encourage you to get this book. She also is the best-selling author of this book. It's called Help, Thanks, Wow. Help, Thanks, Wow. It's all about prayer. And I'm rereading it. But it is so sweet and it is so gentle. And then all of a sudden she'll just have a punchline that is so humorous that I'll sit in there and giggle. So, at my age, I can hide my own Easter eggs and hunt them, and I can reread books, and it'll be like the first time I've read them. So I'm rereading all of Annie's books. So anyway, that's what I have about trauma. Know that if you have been traumatized as a child or as an adult, it was not your fault. You're not broken. You are whole. You can recover, but you must get help. So I'm opening up to, does anyone have anything that they want to ask or comment on?
Tell them they can go to her Facebook page and watch that podcast.
Okay, yes. Misty was telling me you can go to Anne Lamont's Facebook page and watch that podcast. Anne Lamont Facebook page. It's an hour long, and you'll get a little taste. She doesn't talk as much as I'd like for her to on that, but it was all about MC. MC is a woman, but that is how the author writes her name is MC McDonald. And you might be interested in watching that. She's a very smart lady, and she's done a lot of research on trauma. So, anyone have a comment, question, share, talk?